hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you're joining us from. We here at Kabarak University want to extend a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Patience Chepchirchir, and welcome to the second part of this two-part series on reflecting on the first 25 years of the African Constitutive Act. International Law Month at Kabarak is an annual month-long activity aimed at highlighting the international law questions that are relevant to the Global South today. This is the first of these intellectual focus months. It entails a series of webinars which are tailored to honoring cultural and African heritage and history. We have already had a number of these webinars and are yet to launch more, and have also launched a blog on international law in the honor of Bonaya Godana. Dr. Godana's legacy as an African international law scholar was the object of discussion on the webinar that was held on the 18th of July 2025, which had a distinguished panel of Judge Abdelkiu Yusuf, Lawrence Bisson, and Professor Phoebe Okoa, and the family of the late doctor. This webinar can be found on our webpage at Kabarak University Press. Preceding this, we also had a webinar on space law and its implications that can also be found on our University Press YouTube page. The third installment of this series explored the African Union, and more specifically its Constitutive Act, with the first limb of this series exploring the drafting history, legal philosophy, and broad objects of the AU's Constitutive Act. Professor Haja explored the underlying norms of the Act, as well as looking at its substantive structure, echoing the need to treat Africans as the subjects rather than the objects of this law. Judge Ben Kioko also ran a masterclass on the evolution of the African Union and consequently the evolution of its core mandates. Dr. Ibrahima Kane also explored the governance model in the region and how it affects solidarity and the functioning of the African Union. Lastly, Mr. Zopet explored the place of toil in disrupting the borrowed westernized structure of the AU. Today, on our second limb of this two-part series, we explore and focus on the successes, challenges, and future prospects of the African Union and reforms that can be incorporated to make the African Union better. Additionally, the premise of this two-part webinar series mirrors the issue theme of our flagship student-led journal, Kabarak Law Review, on which I serve as the managing editor. We welcome short reflections that may stem from these conversations. If interested, submission guidelines can be found on the journal's website. Additionally, Kabarak University Press is also happy to remind you that Kenya has a candidate for the election to the International Court of Justice for November 2026, a close friend and supporter of the press, Professor Phoebe Okoa. We are honored to support and contribute to her candidacy. Look to our social media handles for this. I'd like to welcome Mr. Humphrey Sipala, Editor-in-Chief of Kabarak University Press, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Patience. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of us who are joining us on this second conversation that we are having to mark 25 years of the Constitutive Act of the African Union. The turn of the century was a moment of reflection for the continental body, for Africa's leaders, for African peoples. The treaty that came out of these reflections towards the end of the last century, the Constitutive Act, tries to bring the best of the Organization of African Unity and the structure that is envisioned in the 1991 Abuja Treaty on the African Economic Community. In many ways, therefore, as we sit here in 2025, as we think about whether this treaty has worked, whether it is what its failures are, what its successes are, what are the prospects for the next 25 years of this Constitutive Act and for our continent, it's instructive to think that some of these ideas were born towards the close of the Cold War, when Africa was wondering what will we become when the new world order comes into place. In many ways, the world, the multilateral framework that has run the post-1945 world order is being dismantled as we speak. And there couldn't be a better time in the political history of international law and in the political history of our continent to reflect on where we are and where we could be going. We're so honored to have a stellar panel of well-informed practitioners, scholars who have been and continue to work on the questions that we're going to reflect today. Kabarak University Press is honored, along with the Pan-African Lawyers Union, who are our co-hosts on this question, and my brother Don Deya, who will be speaking and closing our conversation today. We hope this continues to be a conversation with which PALU and Kabarak University Press can continue to host, so that we reflect and we produce the scholarship and the discernments that will lead Africa into the next 25 years. Welcome. Thank you so much. Patience, please welcome our panelists.
Thank you so much, Mwalimu. So our panel today is made up of 4 stellar minds: Ms. Chenai Mukumba, Mr. Ikechukwu Uzoma, Prof. Sampala Balima, and Mr. Donald Deya. So Mr. Ikechukwu will be our first panelist for the day. Mr. Ikechukwu works as the leader of the African portfolio at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights International Program and has played a pivotal role in various high-stake legal interventions across the continent, including the Paul Rusabagina case and the Nigerian Twitter ban cases. Prior to joining RFK Human Rights Program, Ikechukwu worked in the advocacy and civic space teams at the Open Society Justice Initiative, where he facilitated initiatives aimed at resisting authoritarian tendencies globally and protecting human rights litigation. Mr. Ikechukwu also holds a master's degree from the New York University Law School. He also worked at the Global Justice Clinic at the New York University, responding to human rights issues arising in Ghana and Guyana. Following his LLM, he has served on the NYU International Law and Human Rights Fellowship at the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations, whose headquarters are in New York, where he has played a key role in the operationalizing of the UN-supported Special Criminal Court in the Central African Republic. So today, Mr. Uzoma will take us through the place of regional economic communities within the AU, as well as exploring how various issues, including institutional weaknesses, bureaucracy, and implementation gaps, hinder effective harmonization within the region. Mr. Uzoma, welcome.
Thank you so much, Patience, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to our participants. I'd like to thank the Kabarak Law School Press for this invitation and for the great work to reflect on the Constitutive Act and to create space for us to have these conversations about the African human right, the African Union and its organs, and just about Africa and how we conduct our affairs on the continent. And I think the Constitutive Act, is it coming across? Okay, all right. I think the reflecting on the anniversary of the Constitutive Act is quite pivotal and it's quite a useful approach. So my brief today is to explore the place of the regional economic communities within the AU, as well as how institutional weaknesses, bureaucracy, and implementation gaps hinder effective harmonization within the region. And I would also reflect on some of these challenges in the context of the ongoing African Union reforms that envisages enhancing the the effectiveness of the African Union as we know it today. I had the opportunity to follow the last webinar, and I know that there's been a lot of backgrounding around the Constitutive Act and how it came about. And so I'll focus a bit on the regional economic communities, just to identify them and to picture them in the history of the evolution of the African Union as we know it today, and use that history as a framework within which, or a context within which, to share a bit about the ongoing reforms, as a way to identify a few of the challenges and to highlight some of the mistakes of the past that we must avoid going into the next 25 years or going into the future as a union or as Africans. Now, we have eight regional economic communities within in Africa. I want to say within the African Union, but that may not be a great description of the evolution. So we have the Arab Maghreb Union, made up of 5 countries, and we have the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, made up of 21 countries. We have the Community of Saharan States, made up of 25 countries. We have the East African Community, 8 countries. The Economic Community of Central African States, 11 countries. And the Economic Community of West African States, 12 countries, previously 15. And then we have the Intergovernmental Authority of Development, IGAD, 8 countries, and the South African Development Community, 16 countries. Now, these regional economic communities, of course, as the name suggests, and as Dr. As one of the speakers in the last webinar mentioned, came out of an intentional decision to establish regional entities as building blocks for the African Union as it was envisaged even as far back as the 1999 Secretariat Declaration that moved the Organization of African Union, or transformed the Organization of African Unity into the African Union. And so these regional economic communities have been considered as the components of the African Union, to the extent that they represent the interests of the communities that they represent. And while they have been described as regional economic communities, you would notice, going through the list and how their memberships are formed, that they are not necessarily just geographically aligned. They are not necessarily organized in line with their geographies. So it's been, of course, there's some of them like ECOWAS, like the Economic Community, the East African Community, and some of them that reflect their geographical their geographical locations. But essentially, some of these regional economic communities have been platforms that reflect economic interests, economic development for these entities, for the countries who are members of these regional economic communities. And that's important to note, the fact that just location was not the determining factor for some of them, but shared interest, shared goals, shared objectives, as was the inspiration also for the African Union, even way back when it was the Organization of African States. Now, how do the regs reflect into the structure of the creation of the African Union presently under the Constitutive Charter, under the Constitutive Act? And Professor Hajia mentioned this last week, the fact that Article 3 provides that one of the goals, one of the objectives of the Constitutive Act is to provide for a coordinated and harmonized policies between existing and future regs for the gradual attainment of the objectives of the Union. And this is critical, and this is a conversation that we've had already. what are the objectives of the union? Are the objectives of the union the objectives as contained in the Constitutive Act, or does it go beyond that to reflect the dreams and the aspirations of the Africans for whom the African Union was established? Not to preempt myself, but there's a sense in which the fixation on the structure of the African Union, or whatever entity we've had to reflect reflect our Africanness, or to reflect our coordination as Africans, has focused so much on the on the entity, on the community, on the group that is being formed, the institution being formed, and not necessarily the institutions were formed. So that remains a recurrent theme, and in looking forward, there must be an intentional effort to ensure that the evolving interests of the Africans are reflected in what the African Union does, and in what and in how the African Union operates. Now, let's take a bit of a historical perspective to understand how we got to the regional economic communities we have today. Now, the OAU was founded in 1963. As early as 1980, there was a Lagos Plan of Action, which was a development to reflect the fact that we now had 51 independent African countries, and there was a dream for African unity, both in an outlook thinking about the dreams of the United States of Africa, but also in terms of economic integration, and the fact that there was the belief that Africa could be self-reliant, could be self-sufficient, and did not have to depend on external support or external influences to conduct its affairs. And so after the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, we had the Abuja Treaty, which Professor Kyoko talked about, which now looked forward to identifying the RECs as components of these emerging African institution that would reflect the Africa that was perceived, at least that was conceived in the hearts of the framers of the OAU Charter at the time, or even the Constitutive Act presently. And so the Abuja Treaty established what was called the African Economic Community. We talked about this in the last webinar, so I won't go more into that. However, like Professor Kyoko mentioned, it set out a 6-stage process, and I won't go into that because it was covered. If you are not here for the last one, you can go back to see what the 6 stages were. It meant that there was a goal, there was an end in sight, there was a vision of an attainment that these efforts were geared towards. We don't necessarily see that in the Constitutive Act. And so in thinking about going into the future and bringing the work of the African Union closer to the African people, we must think about what the end is, what the goal is. There must be a goal. We cannot remain an aspirational people. We cannot remain people whose thoughts and whose dreams and whose ideas are not realistic enough for us to put tags on them. I know we have, the Agenda 2063, we have some of these things, but the question is, how do these reflect the dreams and the goals of Africans, and how can we ensure that as those dreams evolve, they are reflected at the African Union level? Now, in 1991, at this time, and Professor Kyoko also mentioned that the date set, if the Abuja Treaty was ratified, the date was signed. It was ratified after 3 years, and so that's why we still have 3 years. But I like to think about it in the fact, especially as we are commemorating the 25th anniversary, that if it was signed the day it was, if it was adopted the day it was, if it was if it came into force the day it was adopted, then this year would have been that 34 years that they talked about as the goal, or as the deadline for achieving these 6 steps. The question is, how far have we gone? We can identify some, and we identified some of them the last time, but a lot more needs to happen. Now, we move from 1991 and the Abuja Treaty, creating the African Economic Community, to 1991 and the African Union being created, and then the Constitutive Act in 2000. And then between the year 2000 and today, we've had so many efforts, and this is where the African Union reforms come in. We've had efforts to rethink the African Union as we knew it post Constitutive Act, and to attempt an analysis of whether or not it was meeting the goals it was set to meet. Now, these goals, unfortunately, were not necessarily. And the other thing to mention in the Abuja Treaty was the fact that it suggested the reduction of the timing. Now, I'm confusing the Constitutive Act and the treaty, but maybe likely the Constitutive Act, I think that's Article 6. But it suggested a reduction of the timeline that was set initially, which was the 34-year timeline, the reduction of the timeline, because I assumed there was some hope in the fact that most of these things because as you see, it's outlined, there are 5-year timelines, 6-year timelines, that we could meet them in shorter order, because it seems like there was some urgency. Now, I mentioned 2007 because there was an audit of the African Union that was commissioned. It's called the Professor Adedeji audit. And what that audit was to do was to look at the African Union as it was constituted, and to audit the activities of the African Union to see if it was meeting its objectives. Now, that audit report did not come out very positively, and there were efforts to even write an addendum to that report to respond to some of the challenges that we have identified. But essentially, the thinking coming out of that audit was the fact that something needed to be done, something needed to be changed. The goals and the objective seems to have shifted from African unity that was definitely going to benefit the Africans to something else that was now looking like what even President Kagame, who ultimately started leading the reforms in 2017, said in a way, and I would like to read it. He said that by consistently failing to follow up on the implementation of the decisions of the African Union, we have made and sent a signal that those decisions do not matter. And as a result, we have a dysfunctional organization in which member states see limited value, global partners find limited credibility, and especially our citizens have no trust. I dare say that continues to reflect how the African Union is perceived. For those who even know that an African Union exists, for those who even consider it in their daily affairs as an entity that thinks about them. It operates in so many ways as a club for member states to, attend to things to attend meetings and just go through the motions. And that has to stop. Now, of course, in 2008, we had the protocol on relations between the AU and the REX. And at this point, we now started having some countries who had, in a sense, contributed to the development of the African Union, step out of the African Union. In 1984, Morocco stepped out of the African Union because of the recognition of Western Sahara. And at this point, you begin to see some level of attrition, where it seems to me certain state parties began to see themselves as bigger than the Union. And the question is, did we set up an intergovernmental organization, or did we set up a supranational organization that would lead to some of those ideal goals that were set initially, in the early days of thinking about African unity? And so, moving a bit more, in 2016, there was now an effort to focus on the financing of the African Union. At this point, there was also now a bit of a shift from the impact of the African Union to the operation of the African Union. The sense in which those two may not necessarily be mutually exclusive, but there seems to me to be a penchant for just making sure that we have a well-oiled organization, as opposed to the fact that we have a well-oiled integration across integration across the continent. So in 2016, there was an effort to focus on financing the union, and the 0.2 levy was set up. And in 2017, what is now referred to as the Kagame reforms commenced, and there were a few changes that were already implemented in 2018. In 2018, there was the restructuring of the African Union Commission, the merger of some of the departments within the African Union Commission, and the goal was to ensure that the African Union as an institution was fit for purpose, as they say, but also was financially feasible. And now between 2019 and 2005, there's been a summit in Kigali, there's been multiple meetings, and we've had different versions of the AU reforms, prescriptions or suggestions as to what the African Union should look like. One that is very close to my heart is some of the recommendations that have been made concerning the African Union human rights mechanisms. There's a proposal to merge the mechanisms with the promotion mandate into one. There's a suggestion to also create a central secretariat and leave the mechanisms as they are, the three of them. But there's secrecy about the process. No one knows about this. Even if people are in and around the African Union know about it, but the African citizens for whom the African Union was set up don't know that the reforms are going on. These reforms have been ongoing since 2017, and there's no end in sight. So one conversation after the other, and we don't know actually where we're headed. Now, with this context, we started to see a downturn also in democratic in the practice of democracy across the continent. We had the coups, the unconstitutional changes of government in West Africa, where we've seen the creation of yet another REC, the Alliance of Sahelian States. Of course, the African Union does not recognize this regional economic community, as it were, established by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But the question to ask is, do the RECs serve the organization of the union, or should the RECs bring the union closer to the people? And that's also one thing that we are not seeing. And in thinking about the next 25 years, this must be how we think about the regional economic communities, because the decisions taken, and we have the data, only about 7% of the decisions of the African Union Assembly of Heads of States and Government have been implemented. And I just learned the other day that 4% of those decisions that have been implemented are decisions taken to implement decisions. So you have an institution that represents 1 billion people with dreams and aspirations that do not consider their role at the African Union level serious enough to implement their own decisions. We've undertaken a research of the ratification of, please let me know how much time I have. We've taken, we've done some research on the ratification of treaties that have been adopted by the African Union since the OAU days. And you find that most of these treaties are signed by the member states, but are never ratified. And it seems like it's just a joke that we come together as the African Union, and no one takes responsibility for the dreams and visions of the African Union. And I think that speaks to the bureaucracy, the lack of the implementation gap, the lack of coordination. Now, things developed to a point where more recently, the African Union used to have 2 ordinary sessions, one in January, February, and another one in May, June, mostly May. But a decision was taken, I think, 3 or 4 years ago to turn the mid-year session to a coordination session with the RECs. Now, that is fantastic. But if that does not change the impact, if that does not change the impact of the relationship of the RECs with the citizens that they represent, and reflect the fact that there is an entity, the African Union, that caters for the interests of Africans, then a change in structure by itself is not important. A change in structure by itself is not essential if it doesn't go to the goals of bringing the African Union closer to the people. So I know my time is up now, and I just want to wrap up with this thought. The fact that there are difficulties and there are challenges that are faced, that we face on the continent, that are serious, they are intractable, they are quite they could be quite overwhelming. But we must depend on the African people to contribute to the development of the continent in ways that reflect the energies, the abilities, the capacities that we have as Africans. I don't think that we are doing enough leveraging on our diversity and our unity in diversity, and that is why we will be having some of the problems that we are having. And so we have challenges of structural challenges within the African Union, but I don't think they're intractable. I don't think they're impossible to work around. But I think the approach must be to bring the African Union closer to the people and to ensure that the dreams and visions of the people are reflected. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Uzoma. Mr. Uzoma has made an effort to stress the need for the African Union, or rather the RECs, to bring people closer to the Union rather than serve their own interests. So thank you so much, Mr. Uzoma. Next, we are moving to our second panelist, who is Ms. Chenai Mukumba. Ms. Mukumba is an executive director at Tax Justice Network Africa. She has also worked as an economic affairs officer at the World Trade Organization and has also served as the policy advisor and center director at CATS International. She was recently elected to sit on the board of Africa Tax Women Network and is also a member of the International Lawyers Advisory Project. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Witwatersrand, as well as holding a Master's in International Relations from the same university. She also holds a Master's in Taxation from Oxford University. She's also a major contributor towards discussions surrounding the implications of the implementation of trade policies on the Global South. Today, Ms. Mukumba will discuss the successes of the African Union Constitutive Act 20 years later, especially on economic integration programs such as the African Free Continental Trade Area Agreement and institutional infrastructure such as ECOSOC and the AUDA-NEPAD within the region, and how these bodies help in fostering economic growth and unity. Ms. Mukumba, welcome.
Thank you so much, Patience. Good morning, good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, friends, and fellow Africans. It's such an honor to be able to speak on this webinar today and reflect on the 25 years since the African Union's Constitutive Act came into being. Before I begin, a huge thank you to Kabarak University, as well as our close friends at the Pan-African Lawyers Union for the invitation to speak in this webinar. So, as Patience mentioned, I was asked to speak on successes of the AU Constitutive Act 25 years later, with a particular focus on economic integration programs, such as the AfCFTA, and forming institutional infrastructure within the region, as well as their effect in fostering economic growth and unity. When thinking about 25 years, for some, one could say that, that's a lifetime, and for others, it's really just a blink. But for me, I think of it this way. If the AU of 2002 was just a child, by now they would have finished school, right? They'd be maybe at university, starting a career, perhaps even thinking about building a family. And so asking themselves, what kind of life do I want to live? Or perhaps even more existentially, how do I want to make my mark? One could say that the AU, in a sense, is at that age, no longer brand new, no longer full of youthful energy, but now with enough experience to look back at what's worked and to acknowledge what hasn't, and therefore decide where it wants to go from here. When the AU replaced the OAU in 2002, it wasn't just a name change. And I think this is something that's been discussed quite extensively. It was an intentional shift, right? From an organization that had fought for our political liberation to one that would now drive our economic integration, peace, and shared prosperity. And so the Constitutive Act was ambitious, it was bold, and it was hopeful. One of the clearest successes of the past 25 years has been the AU's ability to set up institutions to give a certain level of structure to that vision. So you'd mentioned the AUDA NEPAD. This particular institution has been pushing forward regional projects that seek to connect us physically and digitally. Its aim has been to accelerate the implementation of Agenda 2063 towards a prosperous Africa, which is driven by its own citizens and is globally competitive. When you think about some of the successes of this institution, you think about, for example, the Kazungula Bridge. And this was an infrastructure project that was put in place to link Botswana and Zambia to see how it could increase trade volumes as well as reduce border crossing times. It also contributed to a number of one-stop border posts, renewable energy corridors, and has improved trade efficiency and connectivity. You can also think about ECOSOC, which is something that Patience, you also made reference to. This particular institution was created in order to bridge the gap between civil society and policymakers, in order to ensure that the African Union wasn't just a club of governments, right? An elitist group of policymakers, but a forum that would be for all Africans, that would ensure that citizens remained at the center. And then, of course, there's the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is the largest free trade area in the world by membership and brings together 55 countries with over 1.3 billion people. I make reference to these institutions as those that were put in place to bring life, right, to the direction we wanted to go. However, having recognized them, it's also important to note that these bodies aren't perfect, but no institution ever really is. However, they have helped turn big ideas into reality. So, for example, when we think about, some of the ways in which we've seen infrastructure help us achieve our dreams. Just the other day, when I was traveling through East Africa, I was at one of the one-stop border posts. And because of the integration that you are now starting to see that's been facilitated by these institutions, truck drivers that used to, for example, take 2 days just to cross from Kenya to Uganda now just take hours, right? And so that's the power of integration, right? It's not just an abstract reality. It's about real lives and the way in which it affects real livelihoods. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on the AfCFTA because some could argue that this has been one of the AU's flagship achievements. The agreement itself could boost African intra-African trade by more than 50% by 2035, right? But beyond the numbers, right? Because it's important to think beyond just some of the surface figures, the way in which these initiatives are impacting people's day-to-day lives. You can imagine that a farmer, for example, in Mali, is now able to sell her produce to somebody in Ghana without facing punitive tariffs, right? This is some of the breaking down of barriers that the AfCFTA could do. Or, for example, a small textile manufacturer in Lesotho finding a ready market in Rwanda, right? Because of the barriers that no longer exist. if you take a look at one of the most recent reports that was put out with regards to the success of the AfCFTA, the AfriExim African Trade Report indicated that we have, since the establishment of the AfCFTA, seen intra-African trade boost by 12.4%. And as I mentioned, we're expecting to see it increase even further. It's projected to lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty, as well as boost the incomes of 68 million people, as well as, and this is something that's particularly close to my heart as somebody that works for an institution called the Tax Justice Network Africa, yield up to $450 billion in revenue. And then there's also tools such as the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, right? And this is something that is supposed to allow companies in Africa transact in their local currencies, right, when doing business internationally with other AfCFTA members. All of this to help simplify intra-African cross-border trade. This particular payment system could mean, right, that instead of having to use US dollars, a trader in Accra could pay a supplier, for example, in Nairobi in local currency, right? And this is more than just efficiency, it's sovereignty. But, and there's always a but, right, when we think about these things, because I mentioned that even as we talk about institutions, they're not perfect. Trade liberalization, right, without fairness can actually deepen inequalities. And so even as we're thinking about the next steps, even as we're thinking about the future, even as we're thinking about some of these systems that are in place, it's important that we recognize that we also need to be putting in place necessary safeguards. So the countries, for example, that have more developed industries, we need to make sure that they're not taking all of the gains and leaving others behind, right? And this lens of equity is imperative. It's also important to make sure that even as we're thinking about the way in which these systems affect different categories of people, we pay close attention to the gendered impacts, right? For example, of institutions such as these. So I think for me, when thinking about particularly economic integration and the way in which the AfCFTA is helping facilitate this, it's important to recognize that it's not just about moving goods across borders. It's important to ensure that the benefits are shared, right? And that means thinking about how the revenues that are going to come, particularly from the AfCFTA, are raised and how they're going to be shared. One of the things that we at Tax Justice Network Africa spend a lot of time thinking about is how best we can maximize revenue that we are mobilizing within the continent, right? And try to address the various ways in which domestic resource mobilization is undermined. One of the things that undermines that is harmful tax competition, right? Where we're seeing, for example, countries slashing tax rates in order to attract investment, right? And therefore subsequently collecting too little in order to fund their own public services. And what we end up seeing, in a sense, is a race to the bottom, right? And the winners in this type of situation are only the multinationals, right, themselves, who are able to exploit our countries. And so imagine building a beautiful highway across 5 countries, right? But then having no funds to maintain it, right? Or no schools along the way for the children or the traders, right, who use it, no hospitals, no communities, etc. And so this is what happens when we are integrating economically without thinking about ensuring that there's an integration across countries of fiscal policy that has direct benefits for its citizens. And so when we think about the AfCFTA, right, it needs to go hand in hand with coordinated tax regimes, right, amongst ourselves as countries to prevent profit shifting as well as the loss of revenue through illicit financial flows, right? We also need to think about progressive taxes, right, that are raising enough revenue to ensure that we're also able to meet our developmental needs. Now, the other component of the question that I was asked to speak to was Africa's global agency, right? So I've spoken a lot about some of the regional institutions that have been put in place and some of the way they have benefited us, as well as some of the ways we need to think about how we can improve them moving forward. But continentally, we also have a voice at the global level. Over the last quarter, we have started to see the Africa Union find its voice in a number of different global arenas. So we've seen the Africa Union, for example, at COP climate negotiations. We've also seen it in trade talks at the WTO, and now much more recently, for those of you who are following tax conversation, we've been seeing the Africa Union, the Africa Group push for a United Nations Framework Convention on international tax cooperation. When I was attending one of these meetings actually at the UN, where African countries are trying to push for fairer global tax rules, I remember an African delegate standing up in one of those meetings and saying, listen, what we're pushing for by trying to reform the global tax system is not special treatment. What we're asking for is fair treatment. And I think it's important to note that when Africans are speaking in global forums, they're not asking for anything that is additional or extra in terms of how they should be treated. What they are asking for is a fairness in response to a system that was created and formed without us at the table and with a bias towards us, right? And so it's really, really important that when Africans are speaking in global platforms, that we are speaking with one voice, and our demand is very clear, right? That we're not asking for anything outside of what we deserve. But then it's always really important to note that our unity at these global forums is our power, my apologies, is in our unity. And so there have been and there will continue to be efforts to divide us, right? And play us against each other. And that's something that we need to be cognizant of as we continue to engage in these platforms. And so I think for me, as I come to a conclusion, when thinking about the past 25 years and what are some of the lessons that have been learned, there's sort of three that I want to highlight. First and foremost, political will matters, right? When our leaders commit, things move, right? And when they don't, even the best of frameworks gather dust, right? And so it's really, really important as we're moving forward and thinking ahead that we ensure that all of these different ways of thinking, frameworks, etc., are underpinned by a will to make them work. Secondly, financing our own institutions is key. We cannot depend on external donors to fund the AU's core functions. I'm not going to make reference to them, but I think we all know, right, where we've essentially been dependent on outsiders for us to move forward. And so it's so important as we think about the next step, a focus on domestic resource mobilization to finance our own institutions must be central. And then thirdly, domestication, right? Our AU policies mean very little if they're not implemented at home. It's also very important that even in domesticating them, we're thinking about the centrality of citizens within those conversations. So I think for me, I see an incredible opportunity for us as a continent over the next 25 years. There is much that we can do, having learned from the past, right, with regards to where we've made progress and where we need to improve. Ensuring that as we continue to engage in our economic integration, in our economic growth, that we leave nobody behind. We ensure that citizens remain at the center, and we continue to collectively move forward, continuing the vision, right, and the dream that essentially underpinned the Constitutive Act. Thanks so much, Patience.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mukumba. Thank you for reminding us for the need for equity rather than asking for special consideration, because equity would be the thing to move us forward as compared to special consideration. So thank you so much, Ms. Mukumba. We move on to our next panelist, who is Mr. Donald Deya. Mr. Deya holds an LLB with honors from the University of Nairobi, as well as a diploma in human rights from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the University of Lund in Sweden. He is also the CEO at the Pan-African Lawyers Union. He also serves as the chairperson for the Caucus for Children's Rights. He's also the chairperson for the Center of Citizens Participation in the African Union and also sits as the chairperson for the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. Mr. Deya today has been tasked with the role of exploring how unconstitutional change of government within the region undermines democracy, as well as contradicting the principles set out under the Constitutive Act. He shall also explore the strides that can be made towards better governance in the region. Welcome, Mr. Deya.
Thank you very much, Patience. And thank you also to everybody who has stand up and to my fellow panelists for having this conversation. I must sincerely thank and appreciate and congratulate Kabarak Law for the International Law Year, but also for the work that you're doing in anchoring Pan-Africanism, African unity and integration and regional integration from an academic platform, but also one that engages the public so robustly. It is really, really needed at the time we find ourselves. I want to give an apology that I've been moving around so much over the last month that I didn't properly prepare for this webinar. So I'll mostly be speaking from the head, and it might be a bit random here and there. But I'm glad to see on the call my brother Adem Abebe, who has also reflected, researched, and written extensively on this issue of unconstitutional change of government. And he may have some bullet points for us when we open up into the he spoke at the first webinar last week, is that the discussions, the debates, the dilemmas, and the divergences around the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group in African history in the early 60s have continued to plague the continent, and they are partly responsible for where we find ourselves on unconstitutional changes of government in Africa. In that, there are those that push for faster unity and stronger institutions. There are those that move for slower unity. And I think there are actually actors who don't want unity at all, and we're not often courageous enough to state that out and to call it out. Had we had faster unity, had we had stronger institutions, more powerful institutions, especially the AU in Addis, but many other organs and institutions of the AU, we may have been able to deal with the question of unconstitutional changes of government more robustly. The second foundational premise I will make is that unconstitutional changes of government is part of the umbilical cord of the AU, and which animated the transformation and the transition from the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, to the AU, and which has engaged the AU almost since then. And I would posit that lack of a concrete breakthrough on how to handle this issue on the continent is part of the reason for the malaise that the AU suffers to date. And when I narrate, the various steps and norms that we have made, you will see why I say that UCGs is part of the umbilical cord that animated the transformation from the OAU to the AU, from non-interference to non-indifference, and that led us to where we are. But we must also look at issues of context. What's the context in which we are having a discussion on unconstitutional changes of government, or which I can call UCGs, in 2025? There's a general air of democratic regression or democratic recession worldwide, including in Africa. The rise of the influence of China and later Russia in the last 20 years has caused a change in dynamic on how we discuss democracy, governance, human and people's rights. And the waning influence of our colleagues from Europe and North America, who at some point were able to help in one way or another on the issue of democratization and the settling of human rights and accountability in the continent. And over the last few years, the rise of the far right in Europe and in human and people's rights anywhere in the world presently because of these factors. When trying to look at what the AU, or assess what the AU has done on UCGs, or what the AU does on anything, I usually adopt a journey in 3 steps: norm setting, institution building, and then implementation. And to acknowledge that from the year 2000, when we adopted a new set of norms, which both Professor Haja Geldish, the AU Legal Counsel, and Honorable retired Justice Ben Kioko, former AU Legal Counsel, narrated last week, we've usually gone around setting norms, then building institutions and implementing. So when reflecting on the continent's norm-setting journey on this issue of UCGs, we start with the 1990 Declaration on the Political and Socioeconomic Situation in Africa and the Fundamental Changes Taking Place in the World. Then we go to 1995 and the Cairo Agenda for the relaunch of Africa's economic and social development. We can jump to 1999 with the Algiers Declaration on Unconstitutional Changes of Government. Then 2000 and the Lome Declaration for an OAU response to unconstitutional changes of government. All of this led to that 2000 moment where we moved from the OAU to the AU, also in Lome. Then 2002 on the OAU or AU Declaration on Principles Governing Democratic Elections in Africa. Then 2003, when there was a raft of legal instruments that are relevant, but especially the protocol relating to the establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and a couple of others, then all of these get encapsulated in 2008 on the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, a quite seminal legal instrument of the AU, and which the AU has by practice been implementing across the continent, even on countries that have not ratified the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. We can jump here and there, but I think also important, for instance, is 2013 and the commencement of the Silencing the Guns initiative, which initially was supposed to be silencing the guns by 2020, but has since been adjusted to or revised to silencing the guns by 2030. And the guns are not growing silent. They're actually becoming louder. I think another turning point is 2014 and the adoption of the Malabo Protocol, the protocol that would increase the jurisdiction of the African Court to also handle international crimes, especially because it criminalizes unconstitutional changes of government. And I can note in passing that actually discussion on unconstitutional change of government is one of the things that delayed adoption of the Malabo Protocol from 2011 till 2014, especially because many states had misgivings on the issue of popular uprisings or the citizens exercising their constituent power and how this should be handled when we insisted that citizens exercising constituent power is not a crime, which eventually was a compromise that was arrived at. We can also note the 2015, the adoption of AU Agenda 2063 and its insistence on good governance and rule of law as a pillar. In terms of institutions that should have or that should intervene in this, we can talk of establishment of the African Union Commission, right from 2000, the interim period, and the election of Professor Alpha Omar Konare as the first substantive chairperson of the commission. There was also the establishment of the AU Peace and Security Council. There was a strengthening of the African human rights system, our key human rights institutions, especially at the continental level, being the African Court on Human and People's Rights in Arusha, Tanzania, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in Banjul, the Gambia, the establishment of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, initially in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, but now in Maseru, Lesotho. Then starting 2010, the establishment of the African Governance Architecture, the African Peace and Security Architecture, and the African Governance Platform, which really was supposed to be all the AU organs and institutions and specialized agencies that are implicated in democracy and good governance working together to strengthen this on the continent. In terms of implementation, you can see, for instance, the early decisions and actions of the AU Peace and Security Council on military coups that occurred in the continent were actually quite robust. And there was the immediate suspension of a country that had undergone a military coup, and then engagement so that there is a speedy return to democracy. There was a kind of rule of thumb that they would be given like a 6-month period in which any reforms that are required to legal instruments, to institutions within the country would be done, and then democratic election is held. And there are a couple of, spectacular successes. I won't say many, but I would talk about the Gambia in 2017, where both the AU and ECOWAS were aligned, and even the UN then became aligned with them. And Yahya Jammeh, who had lost elections, initially accepted and then rejected the electoral result, was able to be removed, and the person that won the election to be installed. There are a number of others. But we have also had spectacular failures where there was selective application of the AU norms on unconstitutional change of government, and which has led to a discrediting of these norms or the practice of these norms on the continent, such as the unconstitutional change of government in Egypt in 2013, in Burundi in 2015, in Zimbabwe in 2017, in Chad in 2021. The Burundi example, I think, is one of the ones that is remarkable, for me at least, in the sense that when the unconstitutional change first happened, when Pierre Nkurunziza, then president, amended the constitution or got the courts to give a reading that gave him a third term that it did not have, the initial response of the AU Commission then under Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was quite robust. They sent an election observation mission to the country. They looked at the conditions, and they refused to hold an election observation mission, which was one of the very first times that I've seen that happen at the AU. They then persuaded the Peace and Security Council, meeting at the level of Permanent Representatives Committee, to engage and to authorize an intervention into Burundi. That was in December of 2015. Very unfortunately, when the summit met at heads of state level in January of 2016, they slapped her back, chastised the PRC for having taken that action and reversed it. And I think these are some of the things that led to the weakening and the weakening of AU organs in dealing with unconstitutional changes of government. But just in terms of implementation, leaving alone the policy organs and the peace and security organs that constellate around Addis Ababa, you can see, for instance, the African Court on Human and People's Rights in 2016, issuing the judgment in the case of application number 1 of 2014, that's APDH, Cote d'Ivoirian CSO versus Cote d'Ivoire, in which it then ruled for the first time, or articulated for the first time, that it considered ACDEG to be a premier human rights instrument that it would interpret and apply, and applied this to the electoral environment in Cote d'Ivoire. And indeed, the withdrawals of Article 34.6 by Benin and by Cote d'Ivoire emanated from the court's intervention on democratic and electoral processes in those two countries. We ourselves have litigated this matter also at the East African Court of Justice in respect of Burundi and at the African Court. And maybe, when time comes, because I need to rush now, we can elaborate on those. And I also just note that the PSC, the AU Peace and Security Council, has also held multiple discussions on the issue of UCG. So what are some of the challenges in brief? I would say the legacy weakness of the AU in addressing unconstitutional changes of government by incumbents. That the AU and its various organs and institutions have been very clear in addressing, at least in the beginning, military coup d'etats when the military takes power. But they've been extremely lethargic in properly addressing situations where the incumbent begins manipulating constitutions and laws, manipulating institutions and so on, in order to stay in power in ways that are clearly unconstitutional. And this divergence has led to a discrediting of the AU and indeed of the RECs, the regional economic communities, in the eyes of the citizenry. And this has emboldened, among other things, emboldened the soldiers to say that, look here, if citizens cannot change power, through the ballot. We will then help change that power through the bullet or through the threat of the bullet. And we see this in citizens, the instances of citizens celebrating when a coup d'etat takes place. They are not saying that they like coups, but they're saying that if that's the only way they can change the face of their governance, then they're willing to take it as a transitional phase. We also see the waning influence of the AU over the years. So we're in a very optimistic period, I would say, between 2000 and close to 2015, when there was optimism and strengthening the AU, strengthening the REX, Africa coming out strongly in the world to articulate its position. And we see this going down now for various reasons. This has also led to a weakening, especially of the African Union Commission, which is an important actor, not the only actor, but an important actor in terms of initiating action, be it at the Peace and Security Council or at the policy organs of the AU, being the Executive Council made up of foreign ministers and the Summit of Heads of State. There's some sort of depoliticization and bureaucratization of the AUC. So the AUC is no longer political to be able to anticipate things and instigate action by the organs, but reduces itself to a bureaucracy which only does what the political leaders tells it to do, but is no longer proactive to call things. Unfortunately, apart from the depoliticization and bureaucratization, there's also been a depopulation of the AUC. This whole reform initiative that was ordered by the 2016 summit and that began in 2017 under the leadership of the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has had an obsession on streamlining and downsizing. As a consequence, a lot of the crucial departments within the AU have been downsized. We have less analysts, we have less lawyers, so we have less of a force that can do early warning and that can instigate early action. So that I think itself is a problem. Jumping to the way forward, I think we all have to take a moment to do a mea culpa that we have failed Africa. That we had the legal instruments, and they're relatively articulate, although some things needed to be improved. We had the institutions, and the institutions have been given the power, and we have a legacy of the institutions acting, but the institutions over time have become weakened and have become meek, have lost the courage to act, and this has led to, a degeneration of our situation. And then we move forward to repoliticize the AU and repoliticize the REC so that they give proper political leadership to the continent. In terms of rules, we may need to elaborate some of the rules on UCGs on how we handle unconstitutional changes of government, especially by incumbents. I don't think this needs an amendment of ACDED or even an amendment of the Peace and Security Protocol. It's just rules that bring more predictability and that enable more action, especially early. This could be the AUPSC rules. This could also be operationalizing the African Court of Justice, a process that is currently ongoing, because the African Court of Justice is able to interpret and apply and assure compliance with the entire gamut of AU law, and not just human rights law. One specific thing, we overhaul the rationale for AU engaging in election observation and the processes of AU engaging in election observation, especially to trigger early remedial action way before voting day. So I'm calling for a return to the letter and spirit of the AU instruments and of the declarations. And I believe that the new AUC leadership under His Excellency Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, who's still very early in office, can still make a memorable mark on this. And this could be the turning point. We use this as a turning point that we're looking for. Please let me stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deya, for your masterclass on democracy within the region. We would now like to open the floor to questions from the attendees. Anyone with a question, please feel free to raise it in the Q&A section. As we circle round back to Mr. Uzoma for him to give us his reflections on where we go from here in terms of reform, because we've talked about successes, the challenges, but what would this reform look like if we were to start it today? Back to you, Mr. Uzoma.
Right. So your question kind of talks about how we, not necessarily the institutional reforms that are ongoing, which I spoke about, because those, except they are connected to changes in the way we do things at the AU level and at the regional, at the rec level as well, then it's doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So I believe strongly that, for example, we have the protocol on free movement of people, and that has been adopted and um, has yet to be ratified by a lot of our states. And one of the panelists talked about the free trade area and what potential it holds for Africa. We must love Africa enough to see that those potentials are possible and do whatever we need to do to ensure that we are getting ourselves closer to a place where it becomes a place where there's a pathway for Africans to attain their dreams and aspirations. The point I'm making is that we have not had, unfortunately, leaders at several levels. And I'm not just talking about political leaders. I'm talking about community leaders. I'm talking about us as individuals leading in our different spheres. Think of the AU and what it represents as a field that needs the attention of people who know its potential, to nurse it to production. We've got to do better in harnessing our capacities and deploying them appropriately for our development, for our advancement. If treaties are not going to be ratified, they should not be adopted. I know there's value in norm creation, like Dawn mentioned. But the point I'm making is we must no longer be performative. We've got to be proactive. We've got to be goal-oriented. With the rise of unconstitutional changes of government, the establishment of this new group of Sahelian states, the three countries, has that changed anything in the way people think about politics? People think about elections in our countries. The elections hold that the elections that we've seen this year, or we would see before the year runs out and early next year, in a number of countries, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, you see the same happening in Uganda. You find the same typology happening even in Chad. And there are also other examples where you see opposition figures, opposition politicians, the leading opposition figures, denied access to the ballots. So not that elections are rigged these days, but people, we question their citizenship and so they don't participate. In Tanzania, we say the form was not signed, and so the individual who is a leading, who is a leading opposition figure, in, the leader of Chadema, is arrested and detained and charged with treason. You have in Cameroon, where the leading opposition figure ahead of the elections coming up soon by the end of the year is denied access to the ballot. So now citizens don't even have to have a choice to make at the ballot because their choices are taken away from them. That cannot be a way to advance us to unity. That cannot be. We can't make progress that way. So on the one hand, we've got to, it seems like the bureaucracy of the AU, it's quite overwhelming in the way it tries to maybe lead from others. So the coordination with the REX is critical, but the REX must recognize the people. What happened in Nigeria with the threat of military intervention after the coup, I think that was the one in Niger, was this a sign of the fact that we don't pay enough attention. We've got to listen. If we are practicing the government of the people and by the people, we've got to listen to the people. We've got to strengthen and encourage the people, and we've got to harness the capacities we have. So there's a lot of introspection we need to do. There's a lot of looking inward that we need to do, but in doing that, we must remain hopeful, and we must see that there's a path, and the structures we have in place, the laws we have in place, the systems we have in place could actually serve as the path to the destiny that has been designed for us, or we have designed for ourselves in the Constitutive Act and in all these instruments we've talked about. So yeah, I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Uzoma, for your wonderful insights into what more can be done from moving forward. I'd like to invite Ms. Mukumba if she has anything to add on top of what you have said.
No, I actually think I would echo what Uzoma's just flagged. I think in fact, it was one of the points I mentioned right towards the end of what I shared, that I think political will is an incredibly important tool we need to ensure we leverage moving forward. I think as it stands, all of the frameworks that we have, they need to find a breath, right, in order to actually see the implementation on the continent. So I would fully echo, I think, what's just been said.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that being said, we can move to the Q&A. So we'll take the first two as the others stream in. So we have a question from Isaac Ruben. Isaac asks, with regards different AU instruments and lack of political will to ratify and adopt these instruments, how can institutional reform be a guarantee in the continent? Who will enforce these instruments and who will hold the continental stakeholders accountable? Another question from Haifa Elakar. He asks, or she asks, how can the African Union strengthen the role of regional economic communities as drivers of sustainable development and peace, especially in the context of political instability and economic changes? Yes, so I think those are the two questions we have so far. And I think one is for Mr. Deya, the Ruben one, and the other would go to Mr. Uzoma. Mr. Deya, welcome.
Thank you, Patience. Yes, indeed, there are two challenges we face. Challenges of the 55 states ratifying legal instruments that they have painstakingly developed and painstakingly negotiated and adopted. Ratification. The second challenge is one of implementation. Implementation of decisions and policies and common African positions that emanate from the AU policy organs in Addis or from African international courts and tribunals. Both ratification and implementation are in-country affairs. And I think I throw this challenge back to the citizens, especially acting in-country. It is you to push your government to ratify. And it is you to push your government to implement, because there seems to be an implicit kind of expectation that decisions will implement themselves or that ratification will come. So I think the big question is, when we collate as national legal actors, how are we able to push our executive arms of government? How are we able to push our legislatures and other actors to ensure ratification? Develop ratification processes, develop motions, take them either to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Line Ministry, or take them to the relevant parliamentary committee, initiate a process of getting a cabinet paper to support the issue, initiate a process of taking it to parliament, because for most of our countries, ratification must include parliament. Then they'll be ratified. So I think it's what we can do in country that can push us here. I do know that the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council of the African Union, ECOSOC, AU, which is meant to be our civil society body, is working hard on rolling out national ECOSOC chapters. You know, I do know, for instance, that a country that is undergoing assessment by APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, is required by law to form a national mechanism for the peer review process that has to have the citizens. So how can we use these processes to push? I think that really is a more important thing to do. Although I think also my colleagues will speak to it, the issue of the AU and how it's able to harness the RECs is an issue of political leadership and courage. It's an issue of the political leaders at the AU level, the bureaucratic leaders saying, look here, let's have conversations and let the conversations be meaningful and not purely, bureaucratic or just protocol and so on. So Chenai called it political will, which is important, but I think what we need is political courage. And I think a lot falls on the chairperson of the AU Commission, our chief international civil servant, and his or her deputy and his or her commissioners to take more courage and become more proactive in pushing the various organs and institutions and the member states. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deya. Mr. Uzoma, if you have anything more to add.
Yeah, no, I think Don has answered that question. It's leadership. It calls for leadership and it calls for sincere leadership. Like we've got to see that. So the AU is just as strong as its leaders. The RECs are just as strong as their leaders. And these leaders are Africans just like we are. So it's difficult to, like we'll say proverbially, you can take a horse to the stream, but you can't force it to drink. So these systems have been set in place, but we've got to make the best of them, at least try. And even if we fail trying, but let's not fail for want of trying. But that also is, the other point is that, like I said earlier, we must stay hopeful. And I'm staying hopeful, not just in wishing and in looking forward to a time where we have leaders that take on this responsibility as their life's assignment, as their life's calling, but that we also aspire to leadership at all levels, including political leadership. We've got to flood the system with people who own a conscience that can sustain some sacrifice to ensure that we are able to make the changes that we need to see. So as far as I'm concerned, the coordination arrangements for the AU and the RECs is quite impressive. But like Don has said, it has to be meaningful. And we've got to identify our priorities. I particularly do not subscribe to the annual theme structure of the AU, where there's one theme for 12 months and another theme for 12 months that do not seem to build on each other. All these issues are important. Like this year, we're dealing with reparations, and it's important, but we've got to know that we would have to work on reparations until we see its objectives achieved. And maybe this year is the year to begin the work and call attention to it, but we must not forget it at the end of the year. So, and that speaks to the spirit of meaningful engagement. We've got to align priorities on all levels. And the RECs must also take responsibility of engaging with citizens. And like Don has said, if they don't engage, we've got to engage them. But something has just got to move. And I believe strongly in leadership and the fact that someone should shed the light. And in the absence of leadership, we've got to become the leaders, including in getting involved in politics. I do think that is important. All right, I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Uzoma. There is one more question that has just come in. So the question asks, how can we explain the recurrence of coup d'etats despite the norms established by the Constitutive Act and associated protocols? This is a question by Burme Rutakwanga Sylvian from the DRC. I also have a question tying into this. Recently, we've had, as Mr. Deya had put, there is the threat of violence and the violence itself. But what about soft coups that is just a quick change of power, but does not follow the legitimate systems that have been set in place? Because the AU would be the place where we recognize legitimate and illegitimate government. So what is the place of the AU when it comes to such things? So back to you, Mr. Uzoma and Mr. Deya.
Okay. I think, as I tried to say before, that inconsistencies in implementing the AU norms on unconstitutional change of government is what has led to a situation where the AU lacks legitimacy, lacks influence, and lacks the authority to intervene. We had the issue whereby when it is soldiers who take over power in a military coup, the AU was able to act, except for the situation of Yahya Jammeh, where the AU acted well. But when it is the incumbent doing things that are clearly unconstitutional, things that are clearly what you'd call a civilian coup, like, for instance, as Ikechukwu has said, where the incumbent causes a situation where and it's been mostly men, where his key opponents, the ones that run the risk of removing them at the ballot, where they remove them from running, either the election management body declares them ineligible, or there's persecution using courts, which then get them convicted of offenses, which then means that they can't run, which is what Macky Sall tried in Senegal last year. Didn't totally succeed, but which is what the people around Paul Biya are doing now with Professor Maurice Kamto in Cameroon, and the people around Alassane Ouattara himself is doing at the moment in Cote d'Ivoire. The fact that these things are happening and we are not seeing any visible intervention from the AU or from the REX, because either can act. It's not an either. Either can initiate action. You need to see the panel of the wise carrying, a delegation into the country and meeting all the stakeholders, not just the incumbent himself or herself, but also meeting the political opposition, meeting the faith-based leaders, meeting the citizens, meeting civil society, meeting the trade unions, and making it clear that they notice what is happening and that it is not right, and where possible, trying to broker political solutions. So it's the inconsistency of the AU and the REX in intervening, especially when incumbents are blatantly misusing the law or misusing their incumbency, that has led to a situation. And the way forward is to get more political courage by our institutions and to get the people more strengthened to demand action from the government, to demand action from the AU, to demand action from the REX, and the solidarities we build with each other, so that if it is Cameroon today, it is citizens from the 55 African countries making demands on behalf or in support of what our Cameroonian colleagues are saying. If it is Cote d'Ivoire tomorrow, if it is Tanzania, where we're facing serious challenges right now, if it is Uganda, where we're facing serious challenges right now, but it is we, the people from the 55 countries and our diaspora, pushing together with everything that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deya. Mr. Uzoma, would you like to add anything to that?
Not really. I see there's another question on, I think there are multiple questions now. Yeah. On the AU reform. So maybe I just take that, and
Okay.
I don't know why we don't have Chennai on the.
Should I read it out for you?
No. I was just saying, I don't know how we don't have Chennai on the board as well.
Oh,
Yeah, we should get her at least. Yeah, because
there is actually a question for Chennai that has come in
all
from
right.
another side.
But
So, Ms.
yeah,
Mukumba, there's a question. Oh, you could go ahead, and then Ms. Mukumba will come
okay,
in
yeah,
next.
on the AU reforms, the question is whether there are can the recent AU Citizens Participation Campaign and any other reform initiative extend to inspire improvement in peace and security on the continent? I would say citizens' participation is always a win-win. It's always important. It's always essential.
unfortunately, of course, granted, the AU reforms, one of the goals of the AU reforms is to enhance citizens' participation or enhance the relationship between citizens and the African Union. And how they intend to do that is to, in a sense, prop up or support ECOSOC, as Don mentioned, and as well as the Pan-African Parliament. But to the extent that those mechanisms are able to figure out ways to go around some of the challenges that they have already in engaging with African citizens. The reforms focus so much on cost saving that it doesn't seem to allow significant space for the transformation that makes the AU what some of us would want it to look like, one that is responsive to the needs of citizens. I feel like nothing destroys or kills the spirit of an active citizen like the fact that they cannot seek recourse that is granted fairly and through a process that they trust, whether domestically or regionally, which is why also the protection of institutions in our states are important. There was this reference about going to court in Nigeria after the elections that we are manifestly riddled with all sorts of issues, including like election systems just not working for the presidential election. And people were asked to go to courts, but the courts, essentially did not necessarily give people a pathway to see justice done in an election petition case. So we've got to, on the part of the citizens, we've got to grow thick skin and make sure that these efforts at diluting our resolve do not succeed. But we have to make sure we build institutions that can withstand the types of pressure that they face today. I think one important institution in every country is the electoral regulator, and they rarely live up to it, to expectation. The expectation of the citizens. So the EU reforms would not solve the problems we want to see because it's not designed that way. It's designed to save cost and to keep the institution running. But what does the institution do? Like, what does it mean for an institution like the EU to run? It must find expression in the dreams and aspirations of the citizens. So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deya and Mr. Uzoma. So the last two questions are posed to Ms. Mukumba. The first one is there a chance for the African Monetary Fund and other financial institutions in the Constitutive Act to be operationalized? That's the first question. And the second is a question by Prof. Abebe. He asks to touch on the moral and practical leverages that the AU has to convince states to respect the rules. In a way, he asks, is it being a bit too ambitious for the AU in view of standing and capabilities? Yes, over to you.
Thanks, Patience. I think I can respond to, that first question, and then I have a few thoughts around, the conversation regarding citizens. So I think with regard to the African finance institutions, I think there's an incredible amount of potential that exists there. I think, even as we are trying to push for reform at the global level, and I think I mentioned this when I spoke earlier, that there's a lot of conversations that we're entering into as Africans in an attempt to influence the global financial architecture, right? So whether you're thinking about the UN Tax Convention discussions or even sort of our inclusion within the G20, with which I have various thoughts around, I think we can see ourselves trying to influence those discussions. But at the same time, we do need to be thinking about the types of institutions that we want to put in place at the regional level as well. So in addition to, for example, there's reference to the financial institutions, there's also discussions that are taking place about, the African Credit Rating Agency, right? That there's a certain amount of autonomy of power that we need to take ourselves, right, in order to make sure that we are influencing our own sort of monetary policies, financial policies, but also seeing how we can coordinate the way in which we work. I think for me, the discussions that I've been following really take us back to, I think, the conversation that we had right at the beginning of this Q&A session. These institutions will only be as strong as there is political will to support them, or to borrow from what Don said, political courage, right, to support them. I think insofar as we don't have our leaders putting weight behind them and fully implementing them, they will likely remain, sort of cardboard institutions that have really no weight, no say, no influence. And I think this takes me to, the comments that I wanted to make around citizens. I really like the point that, Ikechukwu made, right? That if leaders don't take up their leadership positions, then citizens must do it themselves, right? And so I think insofar as citizens can either be reflected as, I think Don mentioned, civil society, there's also citizens that, play out on the continent within movements. So, within some of these conversations that are taking place around financial institutions, there are spaces for sort of organized citizens to participate and hold their governments to account, right? In order to make sure that we are seeing these platforms move in the direction that we want. But to the extent that even that is not working, a lot of these leaderless movements that we're seeing across the continent also have the power to influence and also have the power to hold our leaders to account, right? So I think for me, it's really to say that there remains a lot of potential. A lot of the institutions that we need on the continent already exist. It's just our need to, and I think to borrow from Don, number one, ratify, and then number two, see to their actual implementation on the continent. Thanks, Patience.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mukumba. A special thanks to all our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. I'd like to welcome Mr. Deya to give his word of thanks, as this two-part webinar was a joint effort by the Kabarak University Press and the Pan-African Union of African Lawyers. Welcome, Mr. Deya.
Thank you very much, Patience. Let me start by responding to the question put by my brother Adam, and I'm sorry we didn't get an opportunity to let you or the other participants take the floor so that we could make this really, really participatory. I would say there's a yes and no to whether we are asking the AU to do more or we're asking more of the AU is its multiple organs, institutions, specialized agencies, and even ad hoc mechanisms, even the high-level panels. That's still the AU. The AU Assembly is the AU. The heads of state can talk directly to each other to stop things from getting worse. You remember way back in 2011, a delegation of 5 heads of state constituted itself to go and talk to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. It does not matter that they did not succeed in the end. It is the precedent they set that proactively they can constitute themselves to go and talk to one of their colleagues to stop things from completely degenerating. So I think we should think of the AU in that way. But also I'd like to challenge us, the people. At a point when we don't have leaders that are strong enough or courageous enough to initiate action, we, the people, should look for the various ways we can. Thinking of that same Libyan situation in 2011, Libyan citizens went to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and complained that there was an Article 58 situation in their country, a series of serious or massive violations of human and people's rights. The Commission, receiving this complaint, immediately referred it to the African Court on Human and People's Rights, a perfect exemplification of complementarity. The African Court on Human and People's Rights, even though it had not been asked to issue provisional measures, issued provisional measures against the Gaddafi administration and sent them to Gaddafi. And Gaddafi promised to engage in them. So you could see how that complementarity worked. Even though it's imperfect, in the situation of Ethiopia, at the behest of Ethiopian citizens, in February of 2022, we went to the African Commission on Human People's Rights and said there's a series of serious and massive violations of human and people's rights going on in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, and that the Commission should act under Article 58 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Within a period of 10 months, it actually issued provisional measures telling the administration that you must protect all your citizens in Tigray and elsewhere, and you must show us what we're doing to do that. And we feel this partly influenced the Pretoria argument that followed a couple of weeks later. So these are the kinds of things we can do, and we should not limit ourselves to court. How, for instance, do we organize ourselves as citizens to engage the Pan-African Parliament, to discuss country situations or discuss thematic issues so we show that we're concerned, and to send recommendations or demands to the member state itself or to other AU organs and institutions? How do we do that? How do we, as academics, for instance, or public intellectuals, for instance, engage the African Union Commission on International Law to propose maybe draft rules on unconstitutional changes of government, one of the things that are recommended, and then send it to the relevant policy organ to initiate discussions on it so that we don't wait? And how do we exercise solidarity with each other? So my final thought is we need a resurgence of Pan-Africanism, especially amongst the people of Africa and African descent. And we need a building or a rebuilding of strong solidarity across the entire continent. So we're all in each other's business, and we all push the system to work to the extent that it can. We need to increase our demands for good governance and for economic, social, and cultural rights. We need to seize this moment when there's a global crisis to assert global leadership and to assert global moral leadership, to speak truth to power. For African leaders and African citizens to go to the world and say we demand a rules-based order. And this leadership can come from civil society. We have the legacy of civic actors like Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. It can come from faith-based organizations or faith-based leaders. We have the legacy of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It can come from artists. We have the legacy of Miriam Makeba, Fela Kuti, Angelique Kidjo, and others. And it can come from the youth. We have the experience and the energy of the Gen Z in Kenya, in Nigeria, elsewhere. We need to fight hard for economic sovereignty, for the world to be fair for us, for more domestic resource mobilization, and that domestic resource to be used to provide us with goods and services and not to be looted. And I celebrate the leadership that people like Tax Justice Network Africa, my sister Chenai, and Afrodad and so on are leading us in fighting illicit financial flows, in reforming the global tax order, in reforming sovereign debt, and so on. And we'll be meeting in 2 weeks' time in Accra, led by Afrodad, to discuss sovereign debt and its impact on us. And then led by ITUC Africa, the International Trade Union Confederation, will be holding a massive citizen rally and demonstration and walk on sovereign debt on Friday, 29th August. And we need to use the AU theme of the year, reparations for Africans and persons of African descent, as a major mobilizing moment to build stronger solidarities by African citizens, whether here, whether in the Caribbean, whether in South America, whether in the global north, to really push the systems to work for us. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mr. Deya. As we come to a close, I still hand the floor over to you to give your final thoughts, and then we close. Yeah.
Actually, that clarion call was actually my final thought. It's how we build our strengths, academics, civic actors, even business people, young people, and so on, to work together for the world that we want.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deya. As we come to a close, I'd just like to echo, as I had mentioned at the beginning, that Kabarak University and Kabarak University Law School and Press offer our support and solidarity to Prof. Okwa as she runs for the International Court of Justice seat. So Let us bow our heads for a word of prayer. Loving Creator of the universe, as we draw this gathering to a close, we thank you for the wisdom shared and the hearts united in this purpose. As we conclude this second discussion, reflecting on the first 25 years of the African Union's Constitutive Act, we thank you for the knowledge shared and the unity of purpose kindled among us today. Grant us humility to listen, courage to act, and the grace to lead with compassion. We entrust our shared journey to you. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a nice day.